Hello and welcome to Lesson 1 of Year 8 Maths, Fractions, Percentages and Decimals. This lesson contains an overview of fractions, percentages and decimals, discussing their relationship and presentations to the equivalent of a whole number as well as a smaller portion of a whole number. Fractions, percentages and decimals are three different ways to represent a whole or part of a whole, in which we can represent a whole number, a proportion that is less than a whole, or a whole number and a proportion that is slightly more. In terms of a whole number is just an isolated number on its own. Take, for instance, the number 1. The fraction equivalent of the number 1 must have its numerator and its denominator exactly the same. And no matter how big such a fraction is, its simplest form will always be 1 out of 1, which is the number 1. 1 can also be interpreted as a percentage, with the only correct percentage being 100%. On a test, you must always put the percentage sign next to your answer so that it is not confused with a whole number or a decimal. And then in terms of a decimal, the following decimals are representative of a whole, being the number 1. If the number was 2, for instance, then your decimal would be 2.0 and your percentage would be 200%. With proportions that are less than a whole, for fractions, the numerator must be smaller than the denominator. With the fraction 3 out of 15, it can be simplified to 2 over 10 and then 1 over 5. The most simple version of the fraction, 1 over 5, is the proper description of its proportion, which is a fifth. A fifth can also be interpreted to a percentage, which is 20%. Then 20% and a fifth can also be translated to the following decimals. And then we look at numbers that are slightly more than a whole. So like decimals per se, 1.5. In a fraction form, there are two fractions. There are improper fractions and mixed fractions, which will be discussed in more detail in Lesson 2. But for now, an improper fraction always has its numerator being larger than its denominator. And for 12 out of 8, we can simplify such fractions, with its simplest form being 3 over 2. We can convert improper fractions to mixed fractions. 3 over 2 is converted to 1.5. A mixed fraction has a whole number and a proper fraction next to it. 1.5 can be interpreted as 150%. Remember to put the percent sign next to your answer. And then going back to the following decimals. In Lesson 1, we are also going to look at rounding with decimals. In high school, usually in the textbooks, and also your teachers may ask you to round to 2 decimal places. If your test paper asks you to round to a certain number of decimal places, then you must do this, or you could lose marks if you don't get consequential marks. So in order to round to 2 decimal places, you have to look at the number that is next. So we want to look at the number that is 3 places away from the decimal point. And with that number, if it is a 0 to 4, we round down. If the third number is a 5 to 9, then we will round up. We are now going to have a look at some examples of rounding. In this example, we have 15.07368. The number in the third place is 3, which we round down. Whenever we round down, the number in the second place stays the same. So our answer will be 15.07. In example 2, we have 46 0.32854. This time the number in the third place is an 8, which means we will round up. When we round up, our number in the second place, 2 decimal places, goes up by 1. So our answer in this case will be 46.33. And now we're just going to have a look at one last example. Example number 3, with the numbers being 0.37506. As the number in the third place is a 5, we are going to round up. As I said, when we round up, the number in the second place goes up by 1. So your answer will be 0.38. Thank you for listening to my video on the overview of fractions, percentages and decimals. The next part will be lesson 2, where we look at improper and mixed fractions in more detail, how to convert improper fractions to mixed fractions and mixed fractions to improper fractions.